Right on. Welcome, everybody, to another edition of This Week in Drones. Every Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern. Thanks for tuning in. And remember that we are live. And so your comments come through. We always love making this a two-way dialogue, getting your opinions, your thoughts, your ideas, your questions. This is going to be one of those topics, I think, where you're going to have plenty of thoughts and questions coming up. We're going to be talking about airspace security, how it works, what's on the horizon. And I mean, this week I posted a handful of polls and different posts on LinkedIn, and there was a ton of dialogue out there. Thanks everybody for participating in that and showing up to the table, sleeves rolled up, ready to go. Some healthy back and forth, but it really did reveal that there's a lot of education still needed on how do we protect the airspace over critical infrastructure, over ports and airports, and correctional facilities and all over the place, football, NFL games, anything, you name it. How do we protect that airspace? Who's allowed to do what in that airspace? So with that said, I'm David Lewin, obviously, your host. Also, regional sales manager with Echodyne Radars. And then Ron, do you want to do an intro? And then Matt, and then Brandon, and then I'll let you take it from there, Brandon.
Sure. I'm Ron Leach from Leach Strategic Partners, 30 years of aviation experience and 15 with the New Jersey State Police Aviation Bureau, where I started their drone program there as well. And now I since retired, actually 7 years to the day retired, that I started my consulting company here.
Excellent. And actually, won't you be at Expo coming up in a couple
I will
weeks?
be.
Okay,
Yep.
And Matt as well, right?
I will be.
And Brandon, I hadn't asked you, but no, that's...
Not this year.
Okay. Well, I will be as well. So, it'll be great to see all you guys, half you guys in person. Matt, go for it.
Yeah. Matt Sloane, co-founder of Skyfire AI. We work primarily with public safety agencies on getting drone programs started and drone first responder programs. So glad to be joining you again. Been a couple weeks since I've been hiding in the shadows. So
it's good to see your face.
Likewise.
Right on. And then I'll let you do an intro and then start the conversation and deep dive with us. I just wanted to mention, Brandon, obviously coming from the FAA, formerly with the FAA, ton of knowledge in this area about how the laws work. And then I wanted, the perspective from Ron and Matt as we go through this, because both of them feet on the ground. Ron, as he mentioned his background, he was very involved in New Jersey, the whole state of New Jersey, right? And the police and what's going on there and all the stories of things that have come out of there not so long ago and all that, and just bringing that state level perspective to this conversation, I thought would be really valuable. And then Matt, of course, being out, boots on the ground, flying drones consistently for your customers, right? And so you know what the airspace looks like and how it works, and also the need to keep it open and flexible too, and not make it a Swiss cheese, as they say, where we start just locking down, everywhere you look, just starting to lock down the airspace over every critical infrastructure in a way that makes it people like yourself wouldn't be able to fly and use drones in the national airspace. So I just want to tee that up, and then Brandon, I'll let you take it away. And guys, we're live. Send in your questions. This is going to be a good one. All right, Brandon, take it.
All right, cool. And Matt definitely does not hide in the shadows. He's just so busy in the shadows that you never see him out there. So he's not hiding for it all.
Some days I feel like I need to hide.
Right. Just kind of cower in the fetal position.
Yeah, exactly.
Make it stop. Good problems to have.
Indeed.
No, David, thank you. Brandon Youngblood, co-founder, CEO of Drone Security Services. As David said, former FAA, left in November. I was the manager of the UAS Security and Counter UAS Coordination Office within the Air Traffic Organization. So glad to be back. We're talking about the Section 2209 requirement. So Congress in 2016, recognized Gatwick and all these other things were kind of going on, that there needs to be a new type of airspace restriction that is specific to drones to protect various pieces of critical infrastructure. And so there's three legislative pushes that first started the requirement and then modified it as new things kind of came along and evolved over the last few years. So again, the original requirement was pushed out in 2016, I'm just kind of reading here. It was originally meant really for critical infrastructure. So the base requirements of the regulation or their requirement for the FAA to create the regulation was critical infrastructure, such as energy production, transmission and distribution facilities and equipment, oil refineries and chemical facilities, amusement parks. And then this last provision, which kind of really threw the FAA for a loop, it says other locations that warrant such restrictions. That type of gray verbiage is not good for a department because, when I was in the FAA and trying to work on this, there was a lot of what does that mean? What was Congress's intent by putting in other, locations? Since they put this rulemaking process within the FAA is obligated by law and required by law to not discuss this regulation with outside entities, including other governmental departments for the most part, in order to ensure that there's no potential giving advantage to other companies or corporations or any other type of insight into what a potential or future regulation is going to look like. Because obviously, if somebody knows something that somebody else doesn't, it gives them that leg up, and that's not fair across the board. And from a government perspective, that's illegal. You can't do that. The government's there to support everybody and not any one individual or whatever. So that last provision again kind of threw everything for a loop. So the requirement again was pushed out in 2016, and then in 2018, more things kind of progressed and happened, and they added a few requirements in the 2209 law. Sorry, I got to look it up again. There it is. And so what they added or they amended was they struck the language distribution facilities and equipment and included distribution facilities, equipment, and railroad facilities. So what they did in 18 is realize that there was a gap in the potential drone threat issue, and they needed additional coverage over additional locations. And so that's what they did in 18. And then they did it again in 2024 with additional requirements, which they added, I believe, hang on one second.
State prisons, I think, for sure, right?
State prisons. And it looks like that was the last specific thing, and then they added a little bit of other nuances in the language of the requirement. So rulemaking, just real fast, rulemaking again takes quite a long time, typically about 5 or 6 years. And the reason why are the requirements not from the department, but by Congress set in law on what needs to be assessed in the rulemaking process, which economic impacts, environmental, and there are all these types of considerations that need to go into place, because once the regulation is in there, it's incredibly difficult to change. And so that's why it takes so long. It's very unusual though, however, it's very unusual for a rule to take this long, 9 years coming up on 10 for a regulation to be put out. What I can tell you, again, I was on, my team was on this rulemaking effort, so I got to be a little bit careful, but the President Trump's executive order 14-192 kind of threw this for a little bit of a loop, because now every federal department is required to get rid of 10 regulations for every one that they implement. So 2209, by the letter of the executive order, would fall into that category. And so they can't release it unless they get rid of 10 regulations, unless they get exempted from the administration from that executive order to push out the 2209 reg. So I know there's a lot of critical infrastructure sites. There's a lot of other entities that are, we need this now, especially with the New Jersey, New York incident that kind of came up to protect some of these stations. No one really knows what's in the rule, and no one really understands how it's going to look when it comes out, if it's going to be enough, if there's enough teeth and all that other stuff. So that's 2209 in the rulemaking. Now, when 2209 initially came out, a lot of these other facilities are like, hey, we can't wait. We can't wait for a rule. We need to protect some of our assets today. And so the FAA said, we gotcha. So the FAA has the authority to restrict airspace from a national security perspective under 14 CFR 99.7, which is a special security instruction, oftentimes called the TFR, but it's really not. It's different. And so if you are the Department of Defense, a federal law enforcement agency, or an intelligence community agency like the CIA or something like that, you can qualify for one of these, what we normal nomenclature is a 99.7 is what we call them. And so we started issuing, they started, we back in 6 months ago, started issuing out these 99.7s in lieu of the 2209s coming out to provide some type of airspace security over these sites that were vulnerable. However, again, that was limited to only federal law enforcement type entities and the Department of Defense. And so we're just real fast, I want to present my screen because all of this is what happened? I closed it.
I want to say, Brandon, in layman's terms, for folks out there listening, I mean, this is the path. These two laws basically are is the path to protecting the airspace. Like when people say, why is a drone allowed to fly wherever over a prison and drop contraband? It's like, well, technically they're doing something illegal, but also they're not breaking an airspace law. They can fly over a prison in this example, right? Same with like even at an airport, isn't it? Is that different, or is that the same?
That's different. Yeah. Now you're dealing with controlled airspace. I'll give you an example though of what you're talking about, because you're absolutely right. So the FAA publishes this. The team that I used to manage was the primary source behind a lot of this information that's in this website. AJV Alpha, which is a team that actually manages this website, we work very closely with them to get the data on it. So if you just go to Google, type in FAA UDDS, which is UAS Data Delivery System, and then if you go down here to the visualize it section of the website, click open, it brings up this Esri ArcGIS based tool. And so I'm going to just get rid of some stuff for the sake of speed. So in here, this is all static airspace, meaning this is not a dynamic tool. This is updated, I believe, about every 24 hours. And so if there's, let's say, a presidential movement and there's a 91-141 TFR that is always over the president, wherever the president goes, there's a 91-141 TFR to protect the president. And so that's not displayed on here because it's very dynamic, it's very mobile, and that is just not the way this system is designed to work. And so there are limitations in this, and I'll get to that. But for the sake of this discussion, all of these red areas, well, most of them. Let me facility map that. So all these red areas are 99.7 national security flight restrictions. And so if you click on any of them, you can pull up what it is. So this one happens to be, the proponents, the DoD. This is the Army at Fort Benning. If there's an airspace class type that it sits within or underneath, it's this Class D. And then if you need access to it, so let's say I'm a critical infrastructure inspection, UAS company operator, power plant, or whatever, you can call this number and they are supposed to answer and say, hey, this is who I am, blah, blah, blah. May I enter this airspace? And depending on what's going on, they may deny you, they may not. And by the policy and the negotiation that we set with, the FAA set with the DoD tracks how many people requested it, how many they denied, how many they approved, et cetera, et cetera. And they submit that to the DoD or the FAA, supposed to be biannually. And so this again is all in lieu of Section 2209 for specifically federal entities. Now, going back to the point, David, that you were making, there are these flight restriction or airspace restrictions over federal prisons. However, they are not over state prisons because there's not that federal national security nexus tie-in. And so because of that, if that prison happens to be in Class G airspace, there is no airspace limitation of operating over that prison. With that said, if you're dropping contraband in the prison, you're violating a whole host of other laws that they can nail you on. But simply being there does not necessarily mean that it's violating any federal or state or whatever regulation. And I know you're going to go with it, but just one second, David. So what we did, because we recognize this, and we, again, the FAA, whatever, my office that I used to man, we recognize this very early. Nuclear power plants, for example, is one of those situations where it's kind of like a common sense thing. People should not be flying over nuclear power plants with drones, period, dot, unless they have a reason to be there. They just shouldn't. It's nuclear, and anything with the word nuclear in it, there should not be a drone flying over it. So what we by policy, not by regulation, we created a way that the Department of Energy, through the National Nuclear Security Administration, the NNSA, could sponsor a 14 CFR 997 SSI national security flight restriction over a commercial facility. But the Department of Energy would have to request that on behalf of that organization. And so that allowed for some expanded use of these flight restrictions. And just to give you an example, Diablo Canyon is a nuclear power plant in California that's run by PG&E. And so while this is a commercial facility, it's nuclear. It's a nuclear power plant. If anything were to happen to shut down operations for whatever reason, it would be devastating for the West Coast from a power perspective. And so the NNSA, through DOE, NRC, all these, it's a soup of acronyms, requested this, and so we were able to figure that out and leverage the current regulations in a different way through policy. To cover some critical infrastructure, of course, we can't do everything because you have to have, again, that national security and national justification nexus.
This is good, man. I'm curious, Matt, you obviously are out, your team's out every day flying drones as a service for other entities, right? And so curious if what does this look like from your perspective? Do you guys reference these sorts of maps and kind of see where you can fly, where you can't fly? I don't know. What does it look like? And you're muted right now, by the way, but love to hear your perspective. Yeah. If we take this too far, what happens to people? Like, does it stop you from being able to fly and serve customers? Like, what, any comments there?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things. One, it's a mixed bag. I mean, I'm based here in Huntsville, so we obviously have an Army facility here, Redstone Arsenal. That is protected by controlled airspace already. That's a Class D airport. So, there are certain restrictions there. They have LANCs at that airfield, and so we are able to get access to that. But it's certainly one of those things where, particularly if we're out in places where we don't always fly, something that we pay close attention to. We also do a lot of disaster response work, and there's some interesting things that come up last minute too. So like a perfect example of this, we were down in Tampa last year during I forget which hurricane that was, Milton maybe, and there was a particular site that we needed to inspect. And that one, it literally was at the end of the runway in Tampa. Now, of course, we're talking about an airport, not critical infrastructure there. But the long and short of it was that Tampa was at ATC 0. So, the tower was essentially closed, or as closed as a Class C or Class B airport ever get. And so we knew, there was no risk to aviation operations at the time. But we obviously followed the law. So, we need to get clearance to do that, and we needed to get it quick. And so, we went through the process of getting an SGI COA and calling the state aviation officer who was managing all those assets. So, I mean, our team sort of know the process for working through these things. And we're typically flying in places in the same place over and over again. But of course that changes during disasters. That changes when we're out, doing special event type things where they aren't places that we're doing every day. So, I mean, yeah, there are definitely concerns. I mean, we have some customers, who actually asked us to do some coverage, in DC. Obviously, that's a tall order. I mean, it can be done. We've done freeze waivers for agencies and stuff like that. But there's always a process. It's never an easy process. It's typically not a subscribed process or prescribed process, I should say. So I see Brandon smiling. I know that the FAA works on this stuff. Is like, if it were easy enough to just go to a website and say, all right, I'm going to follow step 1 through 6, and then that's how I'm going to get access. But it changes, by the minute. So, I mean, look, all that to say, there are ways to do all this. They are not uncomplicated ways to do it. And it sort of takes an intimate knowledge of the process. And a lot of these gray hairs come from, interactions with special use airspace and FAA and SGI offices. But, for the most part, it works. It's a bit of a clunky process, but there's a lot of airspace here, and there's a lot of national security and critical infrastructure here. So
if I could, I just want to throw out one thing that the Matt touched on, which is emergency operations and getting access to airspace and SGIs. And so, and real quick, one nuance I want to talk about with the 14 CFR 997 is that's a national security flight restriction. There's only 3 types of flight or airspace restrictions, that have criminal penalties associated with it, where you can go to jail. 997 is one of them. And the 997 is actually what protects Washington, D.C. Metropolitan area on that airspace restriction. It is a 997. 91-141s, which are the presidential, and then prohibited airspace, which is incredibly difficult. And I don't think we've issued a prohibited airspace in well over a decade. And that's because it's very permanent, and it does not go away. It's not temporary by any means. It's there 24/7 and typically up to some rather significant altitudes. And so going to the emergency operation, and Matt, you're 100% right. It's very difficult to navigate some of the stuff in the FAA. It's not by design by any means. It's just very difficult when you're that large of an agency covering that mass of the NAS, right? And trying to push out information, and it's difficult. It is. And it's antiquated system too. It is not caught up to the digital age of a lot of these things. And so it's one of the reasons, again, why I left the FAA, was to try and push out as much information as I possibly could in order to help. But I do want to share this real quick since Matt brought it up. So if you're in an emergency situation and you qualify as one of these types of assets or organizations, if you will, you can call what's called the SOSC. I'm actually a very good friend still to this day with the manager of the SOSC. He's actually retiring here soon. Good for him. He's been in the FAA for almost 40 years, if you believe it or not, which I love to ping that he was in the FAA before I was even born, which is great. But you can call this organization or send them an email. This email is monitored constantly 24/7. It's not one of those things where you send it and it goes into a black hole and request immediate access for an emergency situation. And they will give you a verbal right then and there to get access to that, because they know that time is of the essence, and these types of things do happen. And it's one of those things where you get a verbal and we'll clean up the paperwork afterwards, sort of thing, for those types of activities. And this is all guided by order inside of the FAA and by law. There's a law that backs this process up, and they're very, very attentive to those types of needs. So I just wanted to put that out there since it got brought up.
And by the way, none of that was a criticism of the FAA. It was just an observation. But you're absolutely right. And I will say, and Ron, I'm sure you've had this experience too. The SGI process has gotten so much faster and easier, and I've almost never been told no in a situation where we needed to get in the air and we needed to do it quickly. So I mean, kudos to the FAA on the speed and the ease at which those things are handled these days.
Speaking of Ron, would love to hear some of your thoughts. First of all, can feel free to share a little bit more about your consulting services as they relate to all these topics, I'm sure. And what's your perspective on this, on airspace security and how it's being, how it should be done, or whatever the case there. Any thoughts from your end?
Yeah, well, first of all, I won't tell that guy that he's been in the FAA longer than you've been alive. That's kind of funny. New Jersey, we've really been getting pummeled. If you look at the first Trump presidency, then Biden, and now another 4 years of Trump, the airspace has really had a lot of restrictions and access to it. So having public safety understand how they get access to it when there's a TFR in place is really important. From the SOSC, they really do want to help you. What I'm told is they want to get you to the answer of yes. Sometimes it's just not possible. So The answer has to be no, but they will work around you. Regarding some of these critical infrastructures, we're seeing that in New Jersey now. We have a federal prison that has the CFR, if you will, over it, a nuclear power plant down South Jersey. And we also have a naval weapons station that has the drone restrictions on there. So getting people to understand that they shouldn't be flying in that area is really important.
So yeah, how do people know that? I mean, do you run into folks that just buy a drone and go out to have fun and end up flying in one of these restricted areas? And what does that look like?
So there's a real big gap in training for law enforcement, first responders. How do you handle an encounter? So all these drone programs are great. It's a good first start for public safety to have a drone program. So right away they already understand what the rules and regs are, and then the educational component when you run into an errant operator. Sometimes it could be the cops or the firemen or the errant operator, right? One of the things I say, and it's not a slight, it's cops do cop things and firemen do fireman things. They're trying to get the job done with the amount of time they have to get it done in. And sometimes, if you cut the corners when you're using drones in the national airspace system, you're going to have a problem for yourself.
Well said. That's great. Quick shout out to the folks tuning in and dropping comments. Susan, good to see you. Richard, Jonathan, and one says LinkedIn user. I'll figure out who you are and I'll shout out to you. I'll have to look at. Oh, it's John. There you go, John from New Air. Right on, guys. Well, remember, we're live. If you have thoughts or questions on like how does airspace security work, and if you have a story related to this from flying drones yourself, or the opposite, maybe you're in security and you're trying to better secure your facility, this is a great panel to throw out those questions and comments. But go for it,
David. Going to your question that you asked Ron about kind of awareness, right? How do you know? And so that website that I pushed up there's an export feature on that, and it pushes out an XVS or I don't know, an Excel file, whatever the CSV. There you go. It pushes out a CSV file which can be uploaded into systems. And so when DJI was doing their geofencing, that was one of the sources of information that they would use to do the geofencing. It's because there's a lot more information on there. There's prohibited airspace, restricted airspace, controlled airspace, your flight facility maps for lands. There's a lot of data on there. And so the FAA with the Before You Fly app also leveraged that data source. Then it went to a loft. The loft got bought out by Unusual Machines recently. And so when you pulled that Before You Fly app up, it said green to go. That's what it was cross-referencing, was that website. Again, unfortunately, not all the data is there. There are gaps in it, and it presented some problems because, for example, the stadium TFRs. So for those of you who don't know, there any type of, and I'm going to say this at a high level. I'm not going to get into the specifics, but NCAA, MLB, NFL, NASCAR, Indy 500, some of those events by law were automatically covered by 99.7s, 3,000 foot vertical, 3,000 foot horizontal. And so it's 1 hour post event and 1 hour prior, or 1 hour pre-event, 1 hour post-event. Because of the very fluid and dynamic nature of some of these sporting events timings, they are not posted on that website. And so you could, in theory, pull up the Before You Fly app. It would say green, and you're not actually green. There could be a flight restriction or an airspace restriction up of some kind. It was something that we battled a lot, trying to figure out internally, how do we emphasize this? And unfortunately, the only thing that we could do is put a caveat on the Before You Fly app that says you need to check your NOTAMs before you go operate. And so it was, to me, and I'm going to say this because I'm not in the FAA in a little more anymore, but it was a little unfair to those operators when you present them this data. It says a big old green, clear to fly, but go check your NOTAMs.
But maybe not.
Yeah, maybe not.
We're good, but maybe.
And so that was really a struggle for me as somebody who spent most of their career in operations. It's just very misleading sometimes, and it was a point of frustration. And so I know for a fact they are working on this inside of the FAA, trying to create more dynamic stuff. The issue is like a Major League Baseball game. There's no way to predict when that game's going to end. It could go 12 innings. It could, get rained out and stop early. Who knows? And so the FAA doesn't have the resources to have somebody sit there, which would be the best job on the face of the planet, is to sit there and watch a game, and then when it ends, click off.
Oh, wow.
How awesome would that be?
Well, but what's interesting about those sports TFRs is, we've done some work with a lot of agencies in Atlanta, and obviously the Brave Stadium is right there in Cobb County in Smyrna, Georgia. And, there's a lot of agencies that operate drones over there. And what's interesting, and obviously this, Brandon, but the holders of those TFRs is actually, they're national security TFRs. It's DHS and TSA. And so we get agencies that ask us all the time, like, hey, what if I have a 911 call that I got to run? Now I got to go through Washington to get approval to fly because there's a baseball game going on. And it's like, this is, ultimately it's about you establish relationships locally, and, the baseball games happen multiple times a week during the summer. And so, who to call and all that. But it does, the VIP ones are like, that's easy, right? You just we're not doing anything until the president leaves. I mean, he's in Tuscaloosa this week for graduation at Alabama. And it's like, yep, we're shut down. nobody in Western Alabama is doing anything. But yeah, I mean, the baseball ones and, all the major league sports ones are tough to navigate sometimes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The networking and the relationships are really going to open the airspace up for you when you need it. Real quick for Brandon, if you don't mind, you raised a point about DOE getting commercial power plants the exemption. So I have a client that houses federal prisoners at a county facility. Would that same process work from the Bureau of Justice to get the protection over the county facility?
Yeah, I would definitely. So the difficulty is, sorry for the sigh. This goes back to the great processes that Matt was talking about earlier. So it's very difficult because you have to funnel it up somehow to the right office and the right people. And even the FAA is 30 some odd thousand people. And so it's sometimes it's hard to get that to the right person. Then you have to coordinate through a sponsorship through the Bureau of Prisons. And typically most of those folks just don't know. And they're gonna be like, what are you talking about? This doesn't happen, right? But it does. And so that's incredibly difficult. I have some very specific names that I know who I would call just because I've worked with them for the last 5 years. I don't want to dime them out in this type of situation because I don't want to blow up their email and I get in trouble. There is a process. I would offer to provide you with my contact information, and we could take that kind of offline this, and I could possibly see what I could do to help.
That'd be great.
Work through that. Yeah.
So we have three, and just in South Jersey alone, we have 3 state and a federal penitentiary, and we have a couple different county facilities. And I guess when they're short on beds at the federal facility, they offer them up to the locals to house the inmates.
And so again, you'd have to connect that to a national security justification. So like El Chapo, national threat, and now that Silanola is labeled as a terrorist organization, he'd be considered a terrorist, and so that would be one of those things that, and he's got a propensity to escape from prisons, so that's one of those things that it's a very cut and dry. Yes, definitely. And so you have to build, the justification, the case, and all this other stuff, and then connect it to that national security nexus, and then convince not only BOP but Department of Justice, who oversees BOP, and then the FAA, and it's all possible. It's just a lot of it's the terminology and who you talk to within certain organizations.
All right, so we have some questions. This one from Chris is about airspace restrictions under these rulings that impact the development and operations of tethered drones.
So tethered drones are not treated any differently than untethered drones, so it would apply the exact same way.
Okay. And then someone said, if we could add counter mitigation measures to 2209, what would they be and why? It's kind of an interesting question.
Oh man, I have a feeling someone on that is from my old office or something. They're asking for a reason. So I have to be very careful here again because the 2209 is still in rulemaking, and I can't divulge any information that's embedded in the regulation. What I will talk about is counter UAS and how they use 14 CFR 997s for counter. So embedded in all of the counter UAS legislative authorities, there's 3 for DHS, DOE, DOD, and DOJ. They have to warn the public of an ongoing mission operation or something that they're protecting on the ground. And obviously we don't want folks flying over them anyways, if that comes to that level, that they will mitigate a drone if it goes over that. So the warning to the public is establishing a flight or an airspace restriction over that facility. So that's a bad example. So going back to the prison example, the federal prisons, the warning is we have a 99.7. If you violate that 99.7, there's criminal and civil penalties associated with that. And the way the NOTAM is written for these flight restrictions that have counter UAS, actually all national security have the same language now, is that in accordance with those three laws, you could lose your drone. It could be, I'm not going to say the right words, but it can be mitigated against. And so that warning exists. It's there. So that means that counter or mitigation may or may not happen in some of these restrictions, and for operational security purposes, we don't highlight which flight restrictions don't highlight which restrictions have counter UAS protecting that airspace or not. So you just assume all of it does. But I don't want to touch on the 2209 terminology, and so I'll leave that one alone.
So question I have is, in the future, do you foresee the combination of these laws and the rolling out of 2209 in being able to come back around to almost the geofencing capability that DJI had developed?
So,
I mean, if you link it all together in the databases, like you're saying, into the new technology, into the drones of the world, what do you think?
I'd actually love to hear Matt's position on this, because one of the things that we discussed this heavily inside of the FAA, and that was a rather substantial requirement to put on OEMs to provide this geofencing capability, so it's not regulated. And so if OEMs want to do it as a service, then cool. I mean, DJI obviously just removed their capability, but so and again, obviously this hasn't been mandated by the FAA, and so it's not required. And there was a lot of concern around that based on the undue burden that may put on the OEMs. And so, Matt, you do a lot of software stuff. I'm really curious to hear what your point of view is there.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a double-edged sword, right? I mean, so the DJI geofence restrictions came about mysteriously 24 hours after somebody landed a DJI drone on the White House lawn. And so it was like, clearly they'd been thinking about it. And clearly they had the software already written. And then clearly somebody made a phone call and said, this can't ever happen again. And so then they put these geofence requirements on drones, and they had them on there for years. And, frankly, from an operator standpoint, all right, so as a manned aircraft pilot, I appreciate it, right? And I certainly want to make sure that drones aren't, doing donuts on the runway when I'm trying to land. And so from that perspective, it works great. From a practical perspective, as an operator, I was never going to fly in airspace that I wasn't allowed to, and that I had, permission to do it. Like, for those of you who aren't aware, our office and our testing facility is literally at an airport. It's at Huntsville International Airport. So I have permission to fly there, and it's a gigantic pain to have geofencing, in place that I have to get turned off. Certainly when we operate for public safety agencies, we can get it turned off for a longer period of time than kind of an ad hoc thing. But so it's a double-edged sword. Like, I really appreciate the fact that it's not going to, by default, somebody who goes and buys a drone at, Costco or something can't then turn around and cross the runway at Hartsfield. Like, that's good, right? But it's not good if I'm doing an inspection to Hartsfield and I can't use my drone there because I have permission and all that. So, people were, I would imagine, I don't know the numbers, hundreds of times a day, emailing the DJI FlySafe team and saying, hey, I need access. Hey, can you remove this? Hey, hey, this didn't work. All right, I did it under my login. Now I got to do it under Brandon's login. Then I got to do it under David's login. And, it was like, it's a giant pain for the operators, and it's a giant pain for DJI. And that's basically what DJI said is like, look, this has become like a full-time job for us, and this is not our job. This is the regulator's job to restrict that. And so we give up. I secretly believe that, they did it in the beginning. They did it to make nice with the federal government and say, hey, look, we can all play nicely together. And then obviously everybody's out for blood with DJI right now. And so they're like, look, why are we trying so hard? It's on you. Like, you guys already hate us. So I don't have any insider information on that, but I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, some people would say they all should have them. Some people would say none of them should have them. It was always a sales pitch of every other drone manufacturer besides DJI. They're like, our drones have no geofences on it, so you don't have to worry about it. And it's like, I don't know if that's a good thing or not. So look, there's no right answer here. It's just it's a give and take, right? So, and you could defeat the geofence like super easily. In fact, there's I'll tell a very quick story. We were at the Fire Department Instructors Conference, FDIC, in Indianapolis, which takes place at Lucas Oil Stadium. And so there is a restricted airspace around Lucas Oil Stadium. It should only be active during games, but of course it isn't. It's always active. And we had this big booth with DJI, and they had spent a ton of money on this booth. And, we had all this flight cage, and like none of the drones would work because we were in a restricted airspace. And at the time there was no like easy button. So it was like emailing China and getting a software patch. And of course it was like midnight in China, and it was, so we couldn't get anybody. And so the whole time I'm like, guys, just there's a quick way to do this. Like, you just take a candy wrapper and put it on top of the drone, and then it won't know where it is. And they're like, no, we're going to get China to write a patch and all that. Anyway, long story short, we ended up taping the candy wrapper on top, and then they worked fine. So a 10-cent solution to a $20,000 drone couldn't fly. But all that to say, I mean, look, my point is that whether you have them or not, they're also easy to defeat too. So it's keeping people who like to follow the rules following the rules.
And one thing I want to point out, Matt brought this up, is let's say they're protecting, I don't know, a naval base, right? And that naval base contracted some people to do an inspection of some cranes or towers or whatever. They're doing construction. There's construction using the drones, and they follow all those processes and they do them right. Well, now they have to get hold of a corporate entity who doesn't have any authority over that airspace to get permission to access that airspace, because they're limiting access via software means. And so it applies a strange dynamic where the last person you're going to get, or last organization you're going to get permission to access certain airspace is not a regulator. And that caused a lot of problems too. And I'm sure Ron could probably talk about from an emergency standpoint. Let's say I have a DFR program and I operate an Inspire or whatever DJI is, and I am in an emergency situation. I can't email and wait for Shenzhen or whatever to wake up. I got to get access to this thing now. I'm on the phone with the FAA. They're green lit. I'm good to go, but I still can't get to where I need to be, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I've always been of the thought, if you're credentialed like a pilot, you should be treated like a pilot and have access to the airspace because you're making a decision. There's always going to be clueless and careless and criminal out there that, I don't think they're going to make up the majority of threats to the national airspace system. Yeah, there's threats there, but if you're a pilot, you should have access to the airspace. And I understand why DJI did it. I thought it was a self-preservation thing when they were having people, flying where they shouldn't be flying near airports. And again, the White House lawn, I remember that one. I believe that was a federal employee that landed on that lawn there. But yeah, locks keep honest people honest, right?
It's funny, man. I mean, this whole conversation always shocks people when I'm just hanging out and networking and whatever, or just hanging out with buddies. And, it's like, it baffles people's mind that, you could just take a drone and fly it anywhere you want, anytime, technically. And technically there's really not anything that anyone can really do about it, relatively. I mean, with some caveats in there, but I mean, it's like, people are just shocked, it just makes such interesting coffee table or beer conversations,
I once had a federal regulator, and I think they were in the Inspector General's office, tell me that the only criminal, now, of course, you mentioned this, Brandon, with the TFRs and the VIP stuff, but the only criminal thing that they could actually get you on was failing to register your drone. So you could, in some of these places at the time, this was years and years ago, but I just thought that was funny that it's like you don't pay the $5 to get the registration number, and then you're on your way to federal prison for a couple of years.
Yeah, and that's what have been one of the struggles, and is enforcement of all these things, right? I mean, how do you? It's a challenge. The FAA doesn't have the resources to enforce all this, and then at the end of the day, if they decide to go after anybody, it's actually the Department of Justice and the Attorney General for whatever AG prosecutor that's in that particular state to do it. Now they're always overburdened with cases stacked up, and they're trying like criminal case or murder cases and all the really terrible stuff that prosecutors go after for federal 18 criminal code type stuff. The last thing they're going to want to do is like, hey, little Johnny over here violated a 99.7 because he didn't know it was there, and he didn't really do anything bad as far as flying somewhere where he wasn't. He was curious, whatever, you know what I mean? And so there's also this dynamic of where's the median and how do you leverage resources in the FISDO, and then there's the investigations and everything. And that's one of the things I was really interested with Senator Mike Lee's proposal to bring down airspace 200 feet below, and not, I don't agree with his proposal of making that private property, but there could be, if you modified that a little bit, to bring down the management of that airspace to the state levels and the enforcement, and apply state laws and misdemeanors, and then you have access to a broader law enforcement capability to do general enforcement. And then so now you're treating that low level airspace like a traffic stop ticket, right? So I'm speeding. I almost got pulled over yesterday because I was on my phone. I was on the speakerphone, but the cop came up to me, thought I was texting, and he was like eyeing me on the side. I'm like, hey, I'm not. I promise I'm not texting. But I mean, if that's the case, then maybe they can apply like, hey, you flew somewhere where you weren't supposed to be. Obviously, you're not a terrorist or whatever. Here's a $250 fine. I promise you that person will probably never do it again because it's annoying, and no one likes that, right? And so there needs to be some creative approaches on how to readjust what we've been used to over the last 120 years for airspace management and aviation in this country, because that low level airspace is just so dense and there's so much access to it now. And the price point to get into that airspace is so low, everybody can do it. We need to be more efficient about leveraging the resources that are available to us. And like, we need to change.
Well, so you mean like we should have better legal precedent for entering low-level airspace than a 1920 Supreme Court case about
that too? Yes.
I mean, now we're deep into policy wonk territory here, but yeah,
it's my life, man.
So messaging. The FAA could really step up their game by doing some messaging out there, and then. I'm not a hammer by any stretch, but there was an egregious case out of Philadelphia that was just adjudicated this year, where a guy who clearly deserved to be a poster child for what you don't do is going to end up in a penalty. He got off basically with a slapped wrist, and the adjudication was contingent upon him not doing the activity again. That should be national media. Things like that. That this guy clearly endangered the national airspace system, flying beyond visual line of sight in a busy Class B airspace, racking up $180,000 in fines, and we'll let him go. But not reinventing the wheel. You have school programs where like we had DARE programs for drugs and kids. Get some messaging out there for the kids that fly safe, and get a program started that way. There's resources and ways to skin the cat before there's an errant operator at the younger level.
Well, Ron, and Brandon too. We can all go and do the tour of schools and do the educational campaign, because I mean, we get that question all the time about, can you come in and tell us what we can and can't do? And it's like, yeah, I mean, sure we can, but like, kind of feel like that maybe the FAA should be doing that.
But it comes down to resources again. The FAA just doesn't have it, right?
Oh, no.
And not only drones are not their only thing. I mean, that's a sliver of the big aviation, and the MAX thing happened, and then the continuation of the some of that stuff. And so that's not their. I mean, that 30,000 people, there's a sliver of that organization that is dedicated to drone stuff, and they just don't have those resources. And so one of the things that I always try to push with the FAA too is because if you're in aviation, if you're a man pilot or even just a Part 61 pilot, you go search these things out because you're in the aviation world. You want to find this stuff. You know who to talk to. You know you need to go talk to the FAA. You know you need to go talk to an air traffic control tower, FSDO, whatever. You know what those things are. I could go to Hobby Lobby, Kohl's, even wherever, pick up a drone, and I don't know that I'm supposed to do all this stuff, right? And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because the FAA, one of the things I tried really, really hard to get them to understand from that is that, yes, they're putting out a lot of information, but they're only putting it out on aviation resources. Like, these are not the folks that you need to be talking to. AUVSI, or I'm sorry, not AUVSI, but the FAA drone conference, I can't remember what it's called. Nobody who goes and buys drones at Hobby Lobby or Kohl's goes to the FAA Drone Symposium. Nobody. So you're not educating the right people. In order to get compliance, you have to go to the people that don't understand they are now part of an aviation system. So go on the Joe Rogan show. He has like 20 million followers. Like, push out information on the folks that don't understand this is aviation, but probably have a drone for the hell of having a drone, and it's fun, right? Like, hit those resources, those communication platforms that do not have an aviation nexus and tie-in, so that we can start bringing that tie-in and that knowledge to those non-aviators that are out there.
I mean, look, I'm being a little tongue in cheek here too, but there is somebody in, White House adjacent who's pretty good friends with Joe Rogan. Maybe he can actually get on there and talk about it.
I'll go on the Joe Rogan show. I don't care. I mean, I didn't even know he had a podcast until last year.
Be careful. He's going to get you to try and smoke weed. So I know you're not a federal employee anymore, but
Yeah.
That might be why they couldn't get on.
Yeah.
Real quick, Adrian Cloud said she'd like to help with the curriculum, and it looks like she does a lot of work in engineering curriculum and policy support and unmanned systems.
Adrian, I just texted you and said, be careful what you wish for.
There is, and I do want to throw a plug out. I put this on LinkedIn probably a couple months ago. There is an organization that offers STEM programs specifically for like building drones in high schools and elementary schools, kind of like the Coding for Kids or whatever it is. I think that's a phenomenal idea, and certain schools can say, hey, yeah, come into our school, run like a 2-week program. It's like because you learn how to do circuit boarding stuff and a little bit of programming. That's an excellent way to start, getting into at least the engineering side, which the next step would be, aviation and regulations and knowledge and all that kind of thing.
Well, and in all seriousness too, I mean, there are so many great new UAS programs starting up around the country. And that could be a great way to do that. I mean, we had a really good meeting with the folks up at Middle Tennessee State who have a great aviation program. Talked to somebody from Auburn this morning too. So, some of those programs might be a great way to get that information out there for sure.
I mean, it could be a business opportunity too. Some of these challenges could leave a gap that could be filled by the right model. I mean, maybe it's an online curriculum instead of an in-person thing, school to school, and someone figures out how to distribute that and do well, make a living.
And I would highly encourage any municipalities that are out there that are really concerned about drones, like with what happened in New York and New Jersey. Don't search out counter UAS equipment. Search out educators to bring in and educate your public, and have forums and do this and try to educate folks and say, hey, drones are coming. You're not getting around that. And so they will be delivering our pizzas. They will be delivering your pack. It's already happening. My kids, well, 2 of my kids, one's about to graduate high school, but they will grow up someday being like, you had your pizza delivered to you by car. Where are you, like a caveman? That will happen. And we are living through that transition process. It's the same way in like the 1920s where cars were first starting to come on the road. And a lot of folks are like, I'll never have the car. That very next generation, everybody had cars. This is that point, and you will be on your rocking chair on your porch with a shotgun watching all the drones buzzing overhead, because it's going to happen.
Well, and it happened in Jersey. Ron, you got to witness it firsthand, I'm sure.
and frankly, it didn't go great. So,
No, the messaging was really bad. It was confusing to the public. It was a shame. And then dropping all those TFRs over critical infrastructure. Don't look here.
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, you're
So
right. Here's exactly the place where we don't want you to go.
So we've actually got a couple of criminal codes on the books for the behavior of the drone operator, which is a good way to go. So I've been engaging with some of our legislature before they start passing laws about things they really don't understand. Bring in some experts and talk to them to find out what they can and can't do. So we're making some inroads that way with the state and getting our DOT. They're actually behind. It's not a criticism of them. They're actually behind. They don't really focus a lot on aviation because we're a surface-based state for the most part, and the bigger authorities control the airport. So getting them into the lower level aviation, getting their attention to say, hey, listen, here's something we all can benefit from, make some money, bring some commerce into the state. That's myself and my partner Ray Adams. We're trying to make some inroads in the state, and Dave Krause is another guy that we're all working together to make some headway here.
And I want to touch on that, Ron, because David and I were just talking about this, about state legislation, and there's a lot of stuff going on right now. Florida was very aggressive about this not too long ago, about I have some of the best snipers in the world and we'll shoot them down kind of thing. It was a little odd. So being on the federal side, states cannot dictate airspace requirements. It's preemption. It'll get crushed in court. It won't work. With that said, there are a lot of things states can do. You can control where drones can launch and land from. So let's say you have a state prison. You say no drones can launch or land 5 miles within a state penitentiary, county, whatever. That is a law that's perfectly acceptable. It will hold up in court. You also can pass laws about, stalking and like Ron just said, the operation or what you were using that drone for, intent for. I just saw a law in Texas that's on the books where they have, laws dictating the capture of images and, how that those images are used and purposes and permissions and stuff like that. You can pass laws for like your chemical plants. If a drone causes disruption to operations at this facility, that's another law that you can definitely pass. You cannot dictate where a drone flies, but you can dictate a lot of that other stuff that's behind the intent of why that drone is there.
Right. It's the behavior. They're using the drone as a tool to further a criminal act. So surveilling a correctional facility to see, what time shift change is going on, who drives what kind of car, or peeping Tom. Those offenses already exist in most criminal codes. The drone is merely the way that they facilitate that.
That's interesting. So what's going to happen with some of these? I'm here in Virginia, and they just had the law passed, I think, a month ago. Regarding airspace, I think it was specific to the use of, or to an airspace regulation essentially, but at a state level, which we've just determined is not, something that will hold up in court. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it'll have to go to litigation, and it's unfortunate because the only people that are going to win out of that are the lawyers, because you're going to have to pay the lawyer, and it's a simple argument. I mean, if fortunately I know what I know, and if I got hit in there, I'd be my own lawyer and be like, here's the federal law, that's preemption. Here you go, done. See ya. But a lot of people don't. And I ran into this in Las Vegas, and the police officer actually told me, and I told my entire team, we're off this call, we're done, we're not dealing with these guys, is because he said, well, we'll figure it out in court, and then we'll just take it to court then. And I'm like, dude, that's a misuse of public money and taxes and all these other things. Like, this is not right. But states also, in the defense of those states and the legislatures and the police force, they don't feel like they have any other option because the federal law has just not kept up. And I feel for those situations because they're getting got to do something.
Pressure from the public to do something, either right, wrong, or indifferent. But the educational component for the legislature is really important, though, to stop them from doing something that could potentially have push or blowback on public safety organizations as well.
Yep. Well, excellent. Thanks,
I'm
guys.
curious about that, Matt. Do you guys research like state laws before you go operate or do stuff like that? I mean, how do you tie that in? Because it's got to be a patchwork of legal frameworks inside of each state.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's typically our clients that are driving those conversations. It's particularly, apparent, like in Virginia, where there's restrictions on law enforcement using drones. There's some regulation, obviously, in Florida about what types of drones. There's some areas require you to have a warrant, some don't require. So we kind of rely on them and let them know that that's a local distinction. We're here to help you with the drone piece of it. But your district attorney or your general counsel needs to kind of tell you what the guidelines are for what you can and can't do. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a patchwork. North Carolina, another one.
Right on, guys. Well, we are at the hour. Thanks everybody for tuning in and for the back and forth conversation. That was great. And Brandon, Matt, Ron, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for bringing your knowledge and furthering education in these areas, which is what we've said many times now, that's the key is and the foundation of all this is education. So we'll keep on keeping on, and we'll see everybody next week on Thursday at 1 p.m. on This Week in Drones. Have a good day.
Bye, guys.